Today, I'm standing on the Titanic. Most people know the story of the iceberg, but there's much more to it than that. Why was the ship built? How was it constructed? And what really happened after it sank? Today, we're going through the entire history, from its creation to its legacy. Hope you enjoy. Titanic starts in 1907 with a business decision. In the early 1900s, the North Atlantic route was one of the biggest transport markets in the world. White Star Line wanted to stay strong on that route. The company understood that it could not simply copy other shipping lines and chase speed only to get attention in the newspapers. Instead, White Star chose a different plan. It would build very large passenger ships that could keep a dependable schedule, carry a huge number of people, and make money through size, comfort, and steady service. Southampton became especially important in this plan. It had good links to London, easy access to the European continent, and it fit well into a Southampton-Cherbourg, Queenstown, New York route. That route was useful because it could help White Star protect and grow its westbound third-class business, which mattered a lot. That is why Titanic was built. The idea for the Olympic-class ships took shape in 1907. From that point, the plan for Olympic and Titanic was developed, and then construction followed. White Star was taking a major financial risk with this project, and unlike some rival companies, it did not have large government support behind it, apart from the yearly mail contract. Before Titanic herself could be built, Belfast had to be prepared for a ship of that scale. Harland and Wolff's Shipyard needed major rebuilding. New slipways were made and the giant Arrow gantry was built. This was a huge steel framework that changed the skyline of the yard. It was about 840 feet long and more than 200 feet high. Sir William Arrol and Company built it using Harland and Wolff's plans. Both the gantry and the rebuilt slips were made specifically so Olympic and Titanic could be built there. In other words, the shipyard itself had to be redesigned first. Titanic was not the work of one single genius. She came out of a team effort. Harland and Wolff built most of White Star's ships, and White Star's leaders worked together with the Belfast yard to create a class of liners, known more for comfort than for speed. They were designing a very large steel triple-screw Atlantic steamer. It had to be big enough to stand out because of its size, steady enough to make passengers feel safe, and fast enough to keep schedule without trying to break speed records. Titanic, yard number 401, was laid down on March 31st, 1909. Over the next 2 years, she grew under the great gantry beside her sister ship Olympic. First, the hull and superstructure were built. Then, on May 31st, 1911, Titanic was launched from slipway number 3 in Belfast. At the time of launch, she weighed about 24,360 tons. The launchways were coated with a mixture of tallow, train oil, and soft soap, so the hull could slide into the water properly. But launching did not mean the ship was finished. It only meant the bare hull was now afloat and the long fitting out stage could begin. During this stage, machinery was put into place, boilers and engines were completed, funnels and deck equipment were finished, and the public rooms were decorated. After Olympic entered service, some small changes were also made to Titanic before she was completed. By March 31st, 1912, Titanic was finished. On April 2nd, she carried out her sea trials in Belfast and the Irish Sea. Only a few days later, she was on her way into actual service. Titanic was a steel, triple-screw steamer of 46,329 gross tons. She had about 46,000 total horsepower and a service speed of around 21 knots. The planned passenger capacity was 735 people in first class, 674 in second class, and 1,026 in third class. She had many passenger decks and working decks, enormous engines, and a hull divided by watertight bulkheads into compartments. These features reflected the engineering confidence of the time. The ship could stay afloat if only a limited number of compartments flooded, and this helped create the widespread belief that ships of this size and design were extremely safe. Yet at the same time, Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats, with room for about 1,178 people. She was also built to represent White Star's idea of comfort. First class included the grand staircase, a large dining saloon, a lounge, a gymnasium, Turkish baths, and a swimming pool. Second class was designed to feel truly respectable and comfortable. Third class was much better organized than the older form of steerage travel that had existed before. For years, White Star had been improving migrant travel by laying tables with cloths, serving meals through stewards, and including basic needs in the ticket price, instead of forcing emigrants to bring everything themselves. Titanic took that system and placed it inside a much larger and more modern ship. First class had to attract wealthy customers. Second class had to appeal to the growing middle market, and third class had to remain good enough to keep migrant traffic with White Star instead of losing it to other lines. Titanic was also more than a passenger ship. She was RMS Titanic, a Royal Mail ship. She carried mail, parcels, baggage, food supplies, and passengers traveling for very different reasons. Some were crossing in great luxury, others were crossing in search of work, opportunity, or a new life. All of them were part of the same large commercial system. On April 10, 1912, at 12:15 in the afternoon, Titanic finally left Southampton on her maiden voyage. Even this departure showed how powerful a ship of her size could be. As Titanic moved out, the suction from her huge hull caused the docked ship New York to swing toward her, almost causing a collision before the voyage had really begun. After roughly an hour of maneuvering, the danger passed, and Titanic got underway. That evening, she reached Cherbourg. The port there did not have facilities large enough for Titanic to dock alongside, so passengers and luggage had to be carried out to the ship in tenders. Nomadic brought first and second class passengers, while Traffic carried third class passengers. Titanic arrived in the evening, and the conditions were rough enough that the gangway swayed badly and had to be steadied while people crossed on board. Early the next day, April 11th, Titanic arrived at Queenstown in Ireland, now called Cope. This was her last stop before the open Atlantic. She anchored off Roches Point, took on more passengers, mail and storage. And then at 1:30 in the afternoon she sailed westward. The total number of people aboard after Queenstown it's usually given as about 2,228, though that figure should be treated as an estimate rather than an exact total. At that point the ship was doing exactly what she had been built to do, carrying crew, passengers in 3 classes, cargo and mail across the Atlantic. Once she was out at sea, life on board settled into routine. For first-class passengers, Titanic offered exactly what White Star had promised. Wide open decks, elegant rooms, rich meals, and the feeling of crossing the Atlantic in modern luxury. Even breakfast in first class could include baked apples, grilled sausages, steaks, and chops cooked to order, several kinds of eggs, breads, cakes, preserves, and hot cereals. White Star was selling the idea that an Atlantic crossing could feel like staying in a fine hotel. Second class mattered just as much as a business target. The food and service in second class were so good that on some routes, second class tickets on the Olympic class ships were close to what other companies charged for first class. White Star was not just trying to attract aristocrats and millionaires. It also wanted teachers, professionals, business travelers, families with decent incomes, and people who wanted comfort and social respectability without paying first-class prices. Third class shows an even bigger part of the story. By the early 1900s, White Star had already been improving steerage travel for years. The company had introduced bedding, equipment, laid tables, and steward service for emigrants. And by the turn of the century, westbound third-class travel was much better than the old steerage system had been. On Titanic, third-class passengers still lived simply, but they had organized accommodation, regular meals, and a much more orderly environment than many earlier migrant travelers had known. For families heading to North America, this was extremely important. Many people on board were crossing because they were gambling their future on life in a new country. Below the passenger world, the ship was being worked every hour of the day and night. There were stewards, stewardesses, cooks, bakers, electricians, trimmers, firemen, and the Marconi wireless operators. The boilers and engines had to be fed constantly. Coal had to be moved. Steam pressure had to be kept up. All three classes had to be kept moving through the routines White Star had built into the voyage. Titanic's machinery included 2 triple expansion engines and 1 low-pressure turbine, producing about 46,000 horsepower. For 4 days, everything worked as White Star intended. Meals were served, passengers rested, mail was sorted and handled below. The ship kept her course and maintained service speed. Thomas Andrews and the Holland and Wolff Guarantee Group were also on board, which was standard for a new liner. Their job was to observe the ship in use and note anything that could be improved. By Sunday, April 14th, Titanic was deep into the crossing, and the early excitement of departure had faded into normal routine. The first ice warning that day arrived in the morning. In fact, iceberg warnings had been coming in during much of the voyage. Several had been passed along while the wireless operators were also busy sending and receiving passenger traffic. As evening came on April 14th, Captain Smith did alter the course slightly farther south, but the ship continued at about 22 knots. Then the warnings became more serious. At about 9:40 p.m, the ship Mesaba sent a message warning of an ice field containing heavy pack ice and large icebergs. That message never reached the bridge. At about 10:55 p.m, the nearby ship Californian sent a message saying it had stopped because of ice. But wireless operator Jack Phillips, busy with passenger traffic, answered sharply, and the message did not lead to action on Titanic's bridge. At the same time, conditions were becoming worse for the lookouts. The night was clear but moonless. The sea was unusually calm. That made icebergs harder to see because there was no white surf breaking around their bases. Titanic was still doing what she had been built to do, moving west at speed, keeping schedule and carrying more than 2,000 people through the darkness. The problem was that the route ahead had narrowed into an area of ice. Late that night, the voyage still looked normal from the passenger decks. Dinner had been served, people had returned to cabins or public rooms. The ship continued westward through a cold and calm night. In the crow's nest, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were staring into deep darkness made even harder by the flat sea and the lack of moonlight. Near 11:40 p.m, they finally saw an iceberg almost directly ahead. The warning bell was rung, the bridge was telephoned, and First Officer William Murdoch reacted at once. He ordered a hard turn and sent engine room signals meant to reduce the ship's forward motion. Titanic did begin to swing, but there was not enough distance. Instead of hitting the iceberg head-on, the starboard side scraped along it, and a glancing blow opened at least 5 forward compartments to the sea. What made the collision so dangerous was that at first it did not seem dramatic. Many passengers felt only a slight shudder or scraping vibration. Some hardly noticed anything at all. There was no explosion and no immediate scene of chaos. But deep below, especially around the mail room and boiler rooms, water was already pouring in. Reports quickly reached Captain Edward Smith. Thomas Andrews inspected the damage and understood the problem. Titanic had been designed to stay afloat with 4 compartments flooded, but not 5. Once those forward compartments filled, the bow would sink lower and lower, and water would spill onward over the tops of the bulkheads into the next sections. The ship could not survive. Andrews is widely said to have estimated the Titanic had roughly 1 to 2 hours left, though the exact words he used and exactly when he said them are not completely certain. For a time, however, most people on board did not know any of this. The lights still worked, the ship still felt steady underfoot. Crew members began waking passengers, uncovering lifeboats and telling people to come up on deck, but many hesitated, leaving a large, brightly lit ship to step into a small boat over a black ocean felt completely wrong. Some believed it was only a precaution. Some did not want to leave warm cabins. That hesitation became extremely important, because Titanic did not have enough lifeboat space for everyone. She had 20 lifeboats with room for about 1,178 people, far fewer than the more than 2,200 people on board. From the start of the evacuation, the numbers were already against them. Orders were given for women and children first, but several of the first boats were lowered only partly full, because many passengers were afraid to board. And some crew members were worried that the davits might not safely hold a fully loaded boat the first time it was lowered. Lifeboat number 7, the first one launched, left with only about 27 people, even though it could hold 65. A planned lifeboat drill had been cancelled earlier that day, and the crew had not been properly prepared to fill and lower the boats under real emergency conditions. At 12:45 am, the first distress calls were sent by wireless, first using CQD and then SOS, the newer signal. Phillips and Bright, the Marconi operators, kept sending messages for as long as they could, while other ships tried to understand Titanic's position and decide if they could reach her in time. Carpathia turned and rushed toward the distress calls, pushing far above her normal speed, but she was still too far away to arrive before the end. Californian was much closer, but its radio operator had already gone off duty, and the ship did not answer the distress calls in time. As the time moved toward 1 am, the crisis no longer felt abstract. Water could now be seen in lower parts of the ship, and the bow was visibly lower in the water. Passengers arriving on deck could see lifeboats being swung out and lowered away. The band played while the evacuation continued, first inside and later on deck. At the same time, the mood around the boats was becoming more desperate. Near lifeboat 14, 5th Officer Harold Lowe fired warning shots when men surged toward the boat, trying to get in. The situation in 3rd class was even worse, for several reasons at once. The ship was hard to move through. The danger was not explained clearly enough or early enough. Many people from the lower decks did not understand how serious things were until too late. Some women refused to leave husbands or older sons behind. Some families became lost while trying to find their way up through corridors and staircases they did not know. By the time many 3rd class passengers reached the boat deck, most of the lifeboats had already gone. By around 2 am, the end was close and obvious. The bow was deep down, the stern was lifting, and the propellers could be seen above the water. Only the collapsible boats were left. According to later accounts, Captain Smith then released the crew with words meaning every man for himself. The wireless set kept operating until about 2:10 am, when the last message was sent. Power was failing, the decks were becoming steeper. People began jumping into the sea, trying to cling to the remaining collapsible boats, or simply holding onto rails as the ship rose beneath them. At about 2:18 am, the lights went out. In the darkness, the strain on the hull became too great. The Titanic broke apart before disappearing under the sea. The bow section went down first. The stern settled for a short time, then lifted again, rising high before beginning its last plunge. At about 2:20 a.m., the ship was gone. Less than 3 hours had passed since the collision. A liner that had taken years to plan, build, complete and advertise had disappeared in a single night on her first voyage. Then came the most terrible part. Hundreds of people were left in near freezing water. Life jackets could keep many of them floating for a short time, but they could not protect them from the cold. The sea temperature was below freezing, and people died quickly from exposure. The lifeboats that had already moved away were afraid of being overwhelmed by swimmers, so most did not return right away. By the time some finally did go back, nearly everyone in the water was already dead. In the end, more than 1,500 people were lost, and about 705 survived. Carpathia reached the area a little after 3:30 a.m. and picked up the first lifeboat at 4:10. By daylight, the rescue ship was moving through an ice field scattered with boats, wreckage, and bodies. Survivors were brought aboard through the early morning hours and were given blankets, food, hot drinks, and whatever comfort could be offered after such a night. By mid-morning, the rescue was complete. Carpathia then turned toward New York carrying the living, while the dead were left behind in the Atlantic. The story did not end there. The sinking led almost immediately to official investigations. The United States inquiry began on April 19, 1912, under Senator William Alden Smith, and more than 80 witnesses gave evidence. These investigations examined the ship's speed in ice, the confusion during the evacuation, the fact that no general alarm had been given, the failure to hold a lifeboat drill, and the radio problems that meant a nearby ship did not respond in time. From those inquiries came major changes that shaped modern passenger shipping. Ships had to carry enough lifeboat places for everyone on board. Regular boat drills became required. Continuous radio watch became necessary. Then the International Ice Patrol was created, and the first Safety of Life at Sea Convention followed in 1914. The Titanic didn't just change history, it changed the future of every ship that followed. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe.